The United States targeted three sites used by Iran-backed forces in Iraq on Monday after an attack wounded three American personnel earlier in the day. Washington has repeatedly hit sites used by Iran and its proxy forces in Iraq and Syria in response to attacks on U.S. and allied forces since the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said U.S. military conducted necessary and proportionate strikes on three facilities used by Kataib Hezbollah and affiliated groups in Iraq. Austin also stressed on the point that he and U.S. President Joe Biden will not hesitate to defend U.S. troops and interests, while adding that the U.S. does not seek to escalate the conflict in the region. U.S. National Security Council spokesman Adrian Watson stated Monday's attack on Erbil Air Base wounded three U.S. military personnel, one critically. The drone attack was claimed by the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. It's a loose formation of armed groups affiliated with the Hashad al-Shaabi coalition of former parliamentaries now integrated into Iraq's regular armed forces. Joe Biden was briefed on the attack, which was carried out with a one-way drone attack. The U.S. president directed the strikes in a call with Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, and other national security officials after ordering the Defense Department to prepare a response. A tally by U.S. military officials has counted 103 attacks against its troops in Iraq and Syria since October 17. Most of the attacks have been claimed by the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, which opposes U.S. support for Israel in its war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The deaths in Gaza have sparked widespread anger in West Asia and provided an impetus for attacks on U.S. troops by forces opposed to their presence in the region. There are roughly 2,500 U.S. troops in Iraq and some 900 in Syria as part of efforts to prevent the resurgence of the Islamic State terrorist group. Terrorists once held a significant area in both nations, but were pushed back by local ground forces supported by international airstrikes in a bloody multi-year conflict. All right. For more on this, we are now being joined by Peter Kuznick, professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Peter, thank you so much for joining us and happy holidays. How do you look at the U.S. launching retaliatory airstrikes in Iraq? One is in serious condition after we learned that three U.S. soldiers have been wounded. How serious is the attack and the statements coming from the Biden administration? We do know that this administration was criticized for not doing enough when U.S. troops were attacked a few weeks ago.
The attacks against U.S. forces in the region are almost daily at this point. We know there is outrage throughout the Arab world. They see these images on an hourly and daily basis, and they're just getting more and more furious with Israel and with the United States, which is seen widely not as restraining Israel, but as arming Israel and encouraging Israel. The U.S. veto of the United Nations resolution really stands out in people's mind. Then last week's resolution, the United States watered it down to make it effectively toothless. So they see the United States as complicit. Without U.S. support, many believe that Israel would not be able to carry out this destructive war against the people of Gaza. We know from recent polling that 96% of Saudis want their government to break diplomatic relations with Israel. So there's just the United States responded, but the United States is going to continue to be the target. The United States, however, is trying to walk a fine line. On the one hand, Biden is trying to avoid an escalation of the situation. We know that Hezbollah in Lebanon could get involved. We've got these militias in Iraq and Syria. We already have the flare-up in the Red Sea with the Houthis attacking the shipping in the Red Sea. We are so close to a bigger, more destructive, expanded war that people fear could eventually turn into World War III. So everybody's trying to tamp that down, but there's so much anger and emotion in the region that it's difficult to do.
Has the Israel-Hamas war weakened the U.S. position in the Middle East?
The U.S. is isolated, diplomatically isolated, politically isolated, in many respects, geopolitically isolated. But it not only affects what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East, it also affects the U.S. Condemnation of Russia in Ukraine. The United States looks like the world's biggest hypocrites right now. On the one hand, we condemn Russian destruction of infrastructure, Russian killing of civilians in Ukraine. On the other hand, we are supporting Israel, which is doing more in terms of destroying infrastructure, in terms of killing civilians. Israel did more within weeks than Russia has done in almost 2 years. And the United States will not condemn this, will not break with Israel. And the political ramifications of the U.S. are enormous. Biden's position is very, very unpopular. I know with young Americans, with my students, with that generation, the 18 to 35-year-olds are overwhelmingly opposed to U.S. policy. Biden is paying a big price. In effect, he's saying we're going to let Trump, who's willing to destroy American democracy, win the presidency so that we can support Israel. Biden is probably the strongest supporter of Israel among American presidents, although Trump was in many ways setting the standard before Biden took over.
Peter Kuznick, thank you so much for joining us on WION and for your analysis.
My pleasure.